The widower rancher waited for his mail-order bride, but a Chinese woman who didn't speak English came. Snow fell in slow, endless sheets across the Wyoming hills, muffling every sound except the groan of a distant stagecoach. Alex Anderson stood by his split-rail fence, breath rising white into the gray morning. His coat was worn at the cuffs, his gloves patched, and his eyes, quiet, pale blue things, watched the horizon with the patience of a man who had learned not to hope too quickly. Somewhere beyond that storm, his mail-order bride was coming. Or so the letter said. He shifted his weight, the crunch of ice beneath his boots the only reminder he was still rooted to earth. 4 weeks, he had scrubbed the cabin's walls, aired out blankets, even set aside his late wife's china, the only set not cracked by time or neglect. He had told himself he wasn't trying to start over, only to stop living like a ghost. Yet the ache in his chest betrayed him. It had been 3 winters since the fever took his family. 3 winters of silence so thick he could hear the wind sigh through the rafters like a mourning woman. The stagecoach rounded the bend at last, wheels shrieking over frozen ruts. Alex's pulse stumbled. He straightened his hat, brushed snow from his shoulders, tried to remember what it felt like to greet another soul without the armor of loss. The coach lurched to a halt and the driver, a man half frozen, beard crusted with ice, climbed down. "Anderson?" the driver barked, voice hoarse from wind. Alex nodded once. The driver opened the carriage door and helped down a woman wrapped in a threadbare shawl. She was small, delicate as a reed, her black hair pinned neatly despite the frost clinging to it. Her face was unfamiliar, her eyes dark and searching, not the freckled Kansas woman whose photograph Alex had folded in his coat pocket. The driver handed over a parcel, muttered something about mix-ups at the depot, and swung back into his seat before Alex could speak. The stagecoach groaned forward and vanished into the snow. Alex stood frozen, staring at the woman left before him. She looked up, her breath trembling through parted lips. When she spoke, her voice was soft, melodic, but the words were not English. He blinked. "Ma'am?" She tried again, tone pleading, holding out the letter she clutched in her hands. It was the same envelope he had sent, his name scrawled on the front, but the writing inside meant nothing to her. Her fingers shook. Realization struck like cold water down his spine. She wasn't the woman he had written to. She wasn't even meant to come here. For a moment, they only stared at each other while the wind howled through the fence rails. Then a shiver passed through her frame, so slight it might have gone unseen had he not been staring. The storm thickened, flinging sharp flakes between them. He could have turned her away. He could have sent her to the station house down the trail. But something, maybe pity, maybe memory, moved his hand before thought could interfere. "Come," he said, pointing toward the cabin. "Cold?" She hesitated, not understanding, until he stepped closer and gestured again. Her eyes flickered, fear and relief colliding, and she followed. Inside, the cabin exhaled warmth from the small fire he'd kept lit all morning. He shook snow from his coat and motioned for her to sit near the hearth. She obeyed quietly, still clutching the envelope, her gaze darting between the walls hung with fading photographs and the man who now looked as startled as she did. Alex poured water from the kettle into a tin cup and handed it to her. She took it with both hands, bowing slightly in thanks, though he doubted she knew the word. Her fingers were raw, nails cracked from cold and travel. She sipped, eyes closing with a faint sound that might have been gratitude, or sorrow. He watched her a long while, then spoke softly as if speaking to himself. "You ain't her." The woman looked up, eyes reflecting the firelight. He shook his head, half at her, half at the heavens. "You ain't Abigail Turner." She tilted her head at the name, confused. Then she reached inside her bundle and pulled out a small embroidered pouch, from which she drew a folded piece of paper, delicate, creased a dozen times over. She unfolded it carefully and placed it on the table between them. His name was written there again, along with 2 others in blocky Chinese characters. He traced the letters with his rough fingers, understanding nothing but the quiet between them. Outside, the wind battered the shutters. The roof creaked under snow's weight. Inside, 2 strangers sat divided by language, joined by circumstance. The fire cracked and spat, casting shadows that moved like ghosts across the floorboards. Alex leaned back, rubbing a hand across his face. He'd been ready to offer shelter to a woman he'd chosen by photograph and promise. Now fate had delivered someone whose story he couldn't read. And yet, as she sat there with her small hands wrapped around the steaming cup, he couldn't bring himself to tell her to leave. She seemed to sense his turmoil. Quietly, she rose and placed her hand flat over her heart, then gestured toward him, an attempt at introduction. "My Lynn," she said slowly. The name lingered in the warm air like a prayer. He nodded once. Alex. Her lips curved faintly, repeating, L-I-S. Then she smiled, not with her mouth but with her eyes, and something in his chest shifted, fragile and unfamiliar. The light dimmed as evening drew down. He ladled stew into 2 bowls, placing one before her. She bowed again before eating, careful, restrained, as though every motion were an apology for existing. When she finished, she folded her hands in her lap and whispered something he didn't understand, the sound of it soft as falling snow. Later, when the fire burned low, he made her a bed near the hearth and took his place by the window. Through the glass, snow drifted past the moonlight like ash. He could hear her breathing, slow and even now, the rhythm of exhaustion and safety. He opened the envelope she'd brought again, staring at the words he'd once written, hoping, foolishly, for warmth. Now they were nothing but ghosts between 2 strangers who could not speak to each other. A log cracked in the fire. Alex looked over his shoulder at her sleeping form. For the first time in years, someone else's shadow lay across his floor. He should have felt burdened. Instead he felt awake. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of a distant coyote. He leaned against the wall, eyes fixed on the flicker of firelight against her face. The thought came unbidden, quiet but certain. Maybe this was no mistake at all. The blizzard kept them shut in for 3 more days. Morning after morning, Alex woke to the sound of the wind gnawing at the shutters and the quiet shuffle of Mei Lin moving through the cabin like a whisper. She rose before dawn, always tending to the fire before it died, as though she'd been keeping house there her whole life. Alex never asked her to. He only watched, quietly, half grateful, half uneasy at how easily she filled the silence that used to belong to ghosts. By the 4th day the snow began to harden, a crust of white glass over the yard. He hitched up his coat and stepped out to chop wood, but the world outside was buried so deep it felt like wading through the sky itself. Inside, he could hear the faint rhythm of her sweeping, humming something slow and foreign. He paused mid-swing, the axe heavy in his hands, the sound piercing the cold. It had been years since anyone had sung in that house. When he came back in, she was kneeling near the hearth, wringing out a rag in a bowl of soapy water. She looked up briefly, smiled, just enough to acknowledge him, and went back to scrubbing the floor. The shawl she wore was threadbare, her sleeves rolled to the elbows, revealing thin wrists marked by travel. He set down the wood, uncertain whether to speak. Instead, he poured her a mug of hot water and set it on the table. She looked at it, then at him, uncertain if it was meant for her. He nodded once. She stood, bowed her head slightly, and murmured something that might have been thank you. It became a rhythm, those days, 2 souls orbiting one another in silence. She mended the curtains with threads she pulled from her own dress. She scrubbed the soot off the window panes until light returned to the room. She rearranged the dishes so neatly that Alex found himself pausing each time he reached for a cup, unsure whether to be grateful or ashamed. The cabin began to feel like something breathing again. When the snow finally eased, Alex rode into town for supplies. The townsfolk stopped to stare. Word had already spread. Mrs. Clancy, wrapped in her fox fur collar, cornered him near the mercantile door. "I hear you've got yourself company, Mr. Anderson," she said, her voice sugared and sharp. "A strange kind of mail-order bride, ain't she?" He met her eyes, unflinching. "Stranger than most. You ought to be careful, Alex. Folks talk. Sheriff says it don't look right." Alex paid for his flour and salt, then tipped his hat without another word. As he left, the murmur of gossip followed him like a bad smell. When he returned home, Mei Lin was waiting by the doorway, a kettle steaming in her hands. She smiled faintly, not knowing what had been said in town. For a brief moment, the sight of her, small, steadfast, unaware, pushed the sting of talk away. He unloaded the goods and found her staring curiously at a bar of soap he'd brought back. She touched it like a fragile treasure. Then she dipped her hands in the basin and began washing her hair with it, eyes closed, humming again. Alex turned away, uneasy but not out of shame, out of something softer, something he couldn't name. That night she cooked a pot of thin stew. It wasn't like his wife's. There was ginger, a strange warmth that settled in the chest. They ate facing each other across the small table. She said nothing, but her eyes lingered on the bowl each time his spoon clinked against it, watching whether he liked it. He nodded once. That was enough. Days passed. She began to speak small words: fire, snow, eat. He repeated them, correcting gently, his rough voice slow and patient. She laughed once when he mispronounced something she said in Chinese, and the sound startled him. It was the kind of laughter that made the air lighter, like a bell ringing through frost. But one afternoon while tending the fire, she burned her hand. The cry that escaped her lips cut through the stillness. Alex crossed the room in 2 strides and took her hand before she could hide it. The skin was red, trembling. She looked away, mortified, tears threatening. "Stay still," he murmured, dousing a cloth in cold water and wrapping it gently around her palm. She kept her eyes on the floor, refusing to meet his gaze. When he finished, she pulled back, whispered something under her breath, words he couldn't understand but felt like an apology. He didn't answer. Instead, he left the cloth folded near her chair. The next morning he found the same cloth washed, dried, and folded neatly on his table, a single paper crane resting on top. That night he couldn't sleep. The storm outside had passed, but the silence in his chest had changed. He stared at the little crane, tracing its creases, wondering what it meant. When he looked toward her sleeping by the hearth, the firelight glowed against her face, and he thought of the word she had learned earlier that day, home. Outside, the world was white and endless. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of ginger and smoke. The next morning he found her in the yard, sweeping snow from the porch with a broken branch. Her breath came out in small clouds. He took the broom from her hands, shook his head, and handed her his gloves. She looked puzzled at first, then smiled in understanding, slipping them on with care. Later, when they sat for supper, she brought him a bowl first, setting it down gently before her own. He watched the way she did things, never for thanks, never for show, just out of some quiet need to make life gentle again. That evening the mail arrived by a passing rider. No letter from the agency. No word of the real bride. Alex stood by the window for a long while, the unopened envelope heavy in his hand. Behind him, Mei Lin placed another paper crane on the table, smaller than the first, its wings folded tight. She met his eyes and gestured toward it, then toward the first one beside it. 2 cranes now side by side. Something tightened in his chest. Fear, perhaps, or the first stirrings of understanding. He turned away before she could see the warmth rising in his face. When night fell, he found her outside, staring up at the stars. The wind tugged gently at her hair. He stepped beside her, unsure what to say. She looked at him and pointed to the sky, whispering softly, "Home, many." He followed her gaze, the stars scattered like lanterns over the white fields, and felt something he hadn't felt since before his world broke, a quiet sense of belonging. They stood like that for a long time, the snow sighing underfoot. Words still failed them, but the silence between them no longer felt empty. It felt like something growing. As they turned to go inside, a distant howl rose from the valley below, the cry of a wolf carried through the cold. Mei Lin flinched, instinctively moving closer to him. He felt the tremor of her shoulder brush his arm, and for one fragile second neither moved. Alex looked down at her, the firelight flickering from the window casting gold across her face. She met his eyes, still frightened but trusting, waiting. And that was when he realized the truth settling inside him like a seed in thawing earth. This woman, who could barely speak his name, had already begun to change the sound of his silence. By late February, the snow began to thin into slush, and the world beyond Anderson's ranch thawed just enough for gossip to travel again. Word of the Chinese bride mistake reached every porch, every store counter, every church pew before Alex himself returned to town. Folks had little else to talk about that winter. The telegraph line was down, the river was frozen, and a foreign woman living alone with a widower made fine warmth for idle tongues. Alex rode in one morning with a sack of oats tied to his saddle and silence sitting on his shoulders. He didn't look at anyone as he passed, but people looked at him, eyes that flicked away too late, whispers caught mid-breath. He'd lived in that valley near 15 years and thought he knew the shape of judgment. Yet there was something different in it now, something cold and curious, like children poking around to see if it still hurt. At the general store, Mrs. Clancy stood behind the counter, perfume heavy enough to mask the rot of envy that always followed her. "Well, Mr. Anderson," she said, drawing out the words as she measured coffee beans into a tin. "We hear you've taken quite an interest in foreign culture." Alex didn't answer. He handed her a list written in his own rough hand: salt, flour, kerosene, matches. She read it too slow, letting the silence fester. "You must find it hard," she went on. "Her not knowing our ways, our words. I suppose she'll learn, if you keep her long enough." He took the supplies, left the coins, and walked out before she finished smiling. Outside, the street gleamed with half-melted snow, sunlight cutting off the roofs in silver blades. A pair of boys stopped throwing snowballs to watch him. One of them shouted, "Hey, Anderson, your wife eat with chopsticks." The other laughed until Alex's stare found him. They fell silent. By the time he rode home, his jaw ached from holding back words that wouldn't change a thing. When he reached the cabin, Mei Lin was outside hanging damp clothes on the line, her breath fogging in the air. She looked up at once, reading the heaviness in his posture. "Bad?" she asked softly, her English growing braver each day though still fragile. Alex paused, then shook his head. "No worse than cold weather." She smiled faintly though she didn't believe him. That evening she made rice broth laced with wild onions, a quiet offering. He noticed she didn't eat much herself. As days passed, he caught her glancing toward the horizon often, as if expecting something, or someone, to come take her away. Once she even tried to pack her shawl and a few folded cranes into a cloth bundle, gesturing toward the road. He stopped her gently, his hand closing around her wrist, firm but kind. "You've nowhere safer to go," he said. She looked at him then, eyes dark as creek water. "Town? No like," she murmured. He hesitated. "They don't like much of anything that's different." "Different?" she repeated, touching her chest. "Bad." "No," he said quietly. "Just harder." She thought for a long moment, then nodded as though she understood more than the words. A week later the thaw came sudden and loud. Streams broke open under the sun's touch, and the world dripped like a melting candle. Alex decided they needed supplies from town, new hinges, sugar, seed grain. When he went to hitch the wagon, Mei Lin stepped out with her coat already on. He shook his head. "Town's not worth seeing." But she smiled with that quiet stubbornness that made saying no feel like cruelty. "Help," she said, pointing to herself. "Carry." He sighed and let her climb aboard. The ride was long, the road slick, the wagon creaking as it sank through patches of half-frozen mud. Mei Lin kept her hands folded in her lap, eyes wide at the open fields waking under the sunlight. It was the first time she had left the ranch since the storm. When they reached town, conversation slowed wherever they went. The blacksmith paused mid-swing, the baker's wife leaned through her window, a dog barked and fell silent. Alex could feel the air changing around them, thin, brittle, heavy with stairs. He stopped at the general store, told her to wait by the wagon. When he came out, she was still there, her gaze fixed on a group of women across the street whispering behind gloved hands. Their laughter was sharp, like broken glass on a plate. Mei Lin bowed slightly in greeting, thinking it polite. The women turned away. Alex crossed the street, his shadow long and dark across the snow. "Afternoon, ladies," he said. Mrs. Clancy met his eyes. "Afternoon, Alex. You sure do like drawing attention these days." He looked back at Mei Lin, still waiting by the wagon, then said evenly, "Didn't know decency was a spectacle." Her mouth tightened. "I'm only saying folks notice. They worry. It ain't right, a widower living alone with a woman who minds her own business?" She faltered, color rising to her cheeks. Sheriff Harlan Tate stepped out of his office then, broad and slow-moving, his coat unbuttoned. "Morning, Anderson," he called. "Everything all right here?" Alex nodded once. "Was till the sermon started." Tate scratched his beard, glancing toward Mei Lin. "She from over in Cheyenne?" "No. Further." The sheriff nodded slowly, weighing words. "Well, folks'll calm down soon enough. Winter makes people stupid." Alex didn't smile. He tipped his hat to Mei Lin. "Come on." As they turned to leave, one of the women muttered something that sounded like heathen, and Mei Lin flinched though she didn't understand the word. Alex saw it in her shoulders, the small shrinking in, the instinct to disappear. The ride home was silent. The sun dipped low, lighting the fields in gold and shadow. At a bend in the trail, the wagon hit a rut, jolting hard enough to spill a few apples from the basket. Mei Lin reached for them quickly, but one rolled into the mud. She stared at it, then picked it up, wiped it clean on her sleeve and set it gently back with the others. He watched her in the fading light, how even in humiliation she found dignity in small acts. Something inside him tightened, then softened. When they reached home, she stayed outside for a long while, watching the snowmelt trickle down the eaves. He joined her, the chill biting through his coat. "They look at you," she said quietly. "Like I am wrong." "You're not." She nodded, her gaze drifting toward the last light over the hills. "You angry?" "Not at you." A pause hung between them, heavy and tender. Then she said with effort, "Thank you, for talk." He wanted to tell her there was nothing to thank him for, but the words tangled in his throat. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small coin he'd kept from town. A brass button shaped like a bird, something he'd found in the store's discard box. He placed it in her palm. She looked at it, smiling with her eyes more than her mouth. "Bird," she said. He nodded. "Flies away." She studied the button a moment longer, then closed her fingers around it, whispering, "No. Stays." The wind picked up, tugging at her hair. Behind them, the cabin's windows glowed with lamplight. For a moment, the world seemed balanced between warmth and cold, belonging and exile. From far down the valley came the echo of a distant rider's call, sharp, urgent, carried by the wind. Alex turned his head toward it, frowning. Mei Lin did the same, her brow furrowed, sensing the shift in the air. It wasn't a neighbor's voice, nor a friendly one. Alex took a slow breath, eyes narrowing toward the horizon as the sound faded into the dark. Whatever peace they'd found beneath that roof had just been noticed by the world that wanted it broken. The storm came without warning. One morning the sky turned the color of lead, and the wind carried the sting of a new front rolling in from the mountains. Alex had seen enough winters to know what it meant, ice breaking loose from the river, a storm that could swallow the world whole. He hurried to bring the cattle in, shoulders hunched against the cold, while Mei Lin dragged blankets to the windows, her small hands red from the chill. By dusk, the air itself seemed to freeze. Snow whirled so thick that the barn vanished into white. The cabin walls groaned as if the cold had teeth. Alex barred the door and set the last of the firewood beside the hearth. "We'll stay through it," he said softly, more to himself than to her. She watched him with worry pooling in her eyes, sensing the strain in his voice though she couldn't follow the words. The blizzard raged through the night. Gusts slammed against the shutters, the roof shuddered under snow's weight, and the fire hissed as wind forced its way through the cracks. Mei Lin huddled near the hearth, wrapped in quilts, while Alex sat by the window with his rifle across his knees, an old habit born of loneliness and fear of things unseen. The wind howled like memory. When the roof began to leak, she rose without hesitation, catching the drip in a tin pot. Then another leak started near the bed, then another. Alex climbed onto a chair to patch the holes with rags, his breath turning to mist. Mei Lin steadied the chair silently, her fingers brushing his boot to keep balance. In that brief touch, something passed between them, not language but trust. Hours later the fire dimmed. Alex went outside to fetch more wood, fighting the storm with each step. The cold burned like glass in his lungs. When he returned, she was on her knees before the hearth, striking matches with trembling hands, trying to revive the flame. He knelt beside her, taking the flint. Their hands met in the half-light, both raw from cold. She looked at him, hair falling loose, eyes bright with exhaustion. He lit the fire, and the cabin came alive again with orange warmth, smoke curling toward the rafters. She exhaled softly, relief written across her face. "Fire, live," she whispered. He smiled faintly, voice low. "So do we." When the storm reached its height, the cabin shook. A shutter tore free, slamming open. Snow burst through like a wave. Alex rushed to close it, shoulders straining against the wind. Mei Lin grabbed a rope and tied the latch while he held it steady, the two of them fighting the storm together like sailors on a sinking ship. When they finally secured it, they collapsed near the fire, panting. For a long time they didn't speak. Only the hiss of melting snow filled the silence. Then, faintly from outside, the sound of a horse crying out. Alex froze. He rose slowly, opening the door a crack, and the wind flung a handful of snow into his face. Through the whiteout, he saw the shape of his mare near the fence, half buried and struggling. He cursed under his breath and grabbed his coat. Mei Lin caught his sleeve. "No," she said firmly, shaking her head. "Cold kill. She'll die if I don't." Her eyes pleaded. But he pulled free and stepped into the storm. The cold hit him like a wall. He trudged through waist-high drifts, breath burning, ice clinging to his beard. The horse's cries grew faint. He reached her, brushing snow from her neck, whispering her name. She trembled, weak. He cut the rope tangled around her leg and urged her toward the barn. Each step was agony. When he finally shoved the door open and got her inside, his hands were too numb to feel. By the time he stumbled back to the cabin, he could barely stand. Mei Lin flung the door wide, pulling him in with strength born of panic. His coat was frozen stiff. His face had gone gray around the edges. She dragged him toward the hearth, stripping away the ice-crusted layers. He tried to speak, but his jaw refused. She pressed his hands between hers, rubbing hard, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. "Alex," she whispered, voice trembling. "No sleep. No die." He half smiled through the haze, muttering, "Not yet." She wrapped him in blankets, sat beside him, and fed the fire until the logs cracked loud as gunshots. Hours passed. When warmth finally returned to his fingers, he opened his eyes to find her dozing against his shoulder, her breath soft against his collar. The storm began to ease near dawn. Pale light filtered through the frost-glazed window, touching the edges of the room. Alex shifted slightly, afraid to wake her. Her hand rested on his chest, light but steady. He watched the way her fingers moved with each breath he took, and a thought struck him: how strange that a heart long frozen could begin to thaw from such a small weight. When she stirred, he pretended to sleep. She pulled away gently, stood and tended the fire. Then she turned toward him, thinking he was still lost to dreams, and whispered something soft in her language. The words were foreign, but the tone was unmistakable, tender, uncertain, like a prayer. Later that day they worked side by side to clear snow from the roof. She laughed when he slipped, the sound quick and bright. He threw a handful of snow her way, and for a moment she looked startled, then threw one back. It hit his shoulder, and he laughed too, a rough, rusty sound that surprised them both. By evening the storm was gone. The world outside gleamed white and new. He built a small fire in the yard to burn the broken wood from the shed. She stood beside him, wrapped in his coat, her hair catching the golden light. He found himself saying quietly, "You saved my life today." She shook her head. "You save horse. I save you." "Same." He looked at her, smiling faintly. "Same." They stood together until the fire burned low. When she turned to go inside, he stopped her with a gentle hand on her sleeve. "Mei Lin," he said softly. She looked up, eyes bright under the fading sky. "Thank you." She tilted her head, then touched his chest, just over his heart, and said, "Home." The word hung in the air, fragile and beautiful. He swallowed hard, unable to reply. That night, when they sat at the table eating stew, the cabin seemed warmer than it ever had. Outside, icicles dripped from the roof, each drop a small note in the quiet. He looked across the table at her and thought, not for the first time, that she had been sent by mistake, and that maybe mistakes were how mercy disguised itself. Before bed, he stepped outside to check the stars. The cold bit at his face, but the air was clear. He could see tracks in the snow, hoof prints leading from the ridge toward his land. Fresh, recent. He turned his head, listening. Far off, a sound echoed across the still valley, a low whistle, then the creak of saddle leather. Someone out there, moving slow. Watching. Alex felt the peace of the storm drain from his chest, replaced by the old, familiar tension that lived under his ribs. He looked back at the warm window where Mei Lin moved inside, her shadow crossing the light. The ice had broken. Inside the cabin, inside his heart, and something out there had noticed. When spring finally came, it didn't announce itself with sunshine. It crept in through the drip of melting eaves, the slow collapse of snowbanks, the smell of thawing soil. Alex Anderson stood on his porch one morning, listening to the sound of water running beneath the crusted ice, and felt the quiet ache of change. The storm had passed, but something in him hadn't settled since the night he'd seen those tracks on the ridge. He hadn't told Mei Lin. She was too easily frightened by shadows that weren't hers. Instead, he kept his rifle by the door and his thoughts to himself, watching the horizon the way a man watches a dream he's afraid to wake from. Each day grew softer. The hills began to breathe again, brown grass showing beneath the white. Mei Lin spent her mornings near the creek, washing linens, humming softly to herself. She'd learned more English now, small plain words, but still spoke them like they were borrowed. He caught her once whispering to the sky in her language, eyes closed, palms open to the sunlight. That afternoon, the post rider arrived. Alex stepped out to meet him, the dog barking from the barn. The man handed over an envelope, its seal marked with the agency's crest. The paper looked official, heavy with finality. Alex knew before opening it what it meant. He read it on the porch while Mei Lin hung laundry nearby, the damp sheets snapping like sails in the wind. The letter was brief. "We regret to inform you that Miss Abigail Turner perished in a rail accident outside St. Louis. Any correspondence or funds sent in her name have been lost." Alex's throat went dry. Beneath the ink, he saw the truth uncoiling. Mei Lin had not been sent to him at all. She'd been a mistake carried by fate, a ghost in another woman's place. He folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his coat pocket. When Mei Lin looked over, he forced a faint smile. "Just news from the city," he said. But that evening, Sheriff Harlan Tate rode up the trail. His horse was mud-streaked, his face drawn. Alex met him by the fence, hands resting on the top rail. "You heard from the agency?" Tate asked. "I did." The sheriff nodded grimly. "Then you know she ain't supposed to be here. Word came from Cheyenne. Immigration office wants her turned over. They say she came on a freight line under false papers." Alex's stomach tightened. "You mean they'll lock her up?" "Just until they sort it out." He laughed softly, bitterly. You ever seen him sort anything, Harlan? The sheriff looked away. Don't make this hard, Eli. You got enough folks talking. Let me do my job. Alex said nothing. Tate hesitated, then added quietly, I'll give you till tomorrow. He rode off down the ridge, the sound of hooves fading into dusk. Inside, the lamp burned low. Mei Lin was sewing by the hearth, her hair loose over one shoulder. She looked up when he entered, sensing something wrong. Sheriff, she said softly. Trouble? He wanted to lie, to protect her with silence, but he couldn't anymore. He sat across from her, the firelight flickering between them. They know, he said. About the letter. About you. Her hands froze on the fabric. They take me? He nodded slowly. They'll come tomorrow. She stared into the fire for a long time, her face unreadable. Then she said, barely above a whisper, You send me? The question cut deeper than it should have. He looked away. They won't listen if I don't. Silence fell heavy as snow. Then, quietly, she rose and went to the window, looking out at the hills washed pale under moonlight. When she spoke again, her voice trembled. I run too long. Always run. No more. Alex stood, crossing the room. You won't have to run. She turned, eyes shining. Why help me? He swallowed hard. Because I'd rather fight the world than watch it break you. Something shifted then, something wordless, raw. She stepped closer, reached up and touched his cheek. The warmth of her hand was enough to still the noise in his chest. They stood like that while the fire cracked, both knowing morning would come too soon. Before dawn, a noise stirred them, the faint clatter of hooves beyond the ridge. Alex grabbed his rifle, peering through the frost-blurred window. Lanterns moved among the trees. The sheriff had come early or someone else had. He turned to Mei Lin. Stay here. She shook her head fiercely. No. Please, he said, voice breaking. Stay. But she followed as he stepped outside, wrapping his coat around her shoulders. The air bit at their faces, the snow soft beneath their boots. Two riders emerged through the mist, Tate and another man in a government coat. The lawman raised a hand. Eli, he called. Don't do this. She's not leaving, Alex said. The agent urged his horse forward. That woman's here illegally. Harboring her's a crime. Alex raised the rifle. Not to aim, but to remind them of what a man can protect when he has nothing left to lose. You call it a crime, he said. I call it mercy. For a long moment, the valley held its breath. Then the sheriff exhaled, lowering his hat. God help you, Anderson, he muttered. You always were a fool for lost causes. He turned his horse and rode away. The agent lingered a second longer, then followed, cursing into the wind. Alex stood still until the last echo faded. The world around him was silent again. No wind, no threat, just the slow thaw dripping from the eaves. When he lowered the rifle, Mei Lin was beside him, eyes wide with disbelief. He looked down at her, the tightness in his chest breaking into something fierce and tender all at once. It's over, he said quietly. She shook her head. No, start. He frowned, not understanding, until she took his hand and pressed it against her heart. Start, she repeated, smiling through tears. The word struck him harder than any bullet could have. Inside, the fire was dying. He added a log, the warmth blooming once more. Mei Lin knelt beside him, lighting a small candle from the flame. She carried it to the table, set it next to the paper cranes she'd made, now 3 in a neat row. He joined her, watching their shadows dance together on the wall. What do they mean? He asked softly. She hesitated, searching for words. First, alone. Second, safe. Third, she looked at him, her voice trembling but sure. Home. He reached across the table, taking her hand in his rough one. Outside, the world was thawing, the ice surrendering to the earth. A bird called from the pines, the first sound of spring. She turned toward it, eyes bright, lips parted in awe. He watched her face, illuminated by morning light, and felt the strange peace of a man who had finally arrived where he was meant to be. And as the sunlight reached through the window, catching the wings of those paper cranes, Alex Anderson whispered what had long waited in his chest. You were never the wrong woman. The words hung in the air, tender as new grass, as the snow gave its final sigh and melted into the soil. Thank you for journeying with us through this story, a tale of silence, snow, and the kind of love that doesn't need words. Before you go, tell me something. Where in the world are you watching from tonight? Are you somewhere cold like Alex's Wyoming, or somewhere warm where the snow is only a dream? I'd love to know how stories like this feel in your part of the world. If this story touched you, if you felt the stillness of that cabin, or the thaw of a heart learning to trust again, Let me know in the comments below. Your words keep these old frontier tales alive. Now, click the video on your screen to hear a story even more powerful than this one. A story that will melt your heart and make you believe in second chances all over again. I'll see you there, partner.